given that the text 1984 is part of the Text and Human Experience Common module, I thought we'd begin by starting by looking at this idea that it is part of the human experience to want to be loved, experience connection, find or have a sense of belonging, feel free, have this feeling that you are in, you have some control over your life. And it's true to say that these sort of ideas can be inhibited by fear, oppression, isolation, a sense of powerlessness, and the controlling narratives in our world. And that's very true. This is designed with 1984 in the context of that in mind. That works quite well for the characters of Winston and Julia and others. Okay, so the experiences in the novel, there are many we can explore. We can look at living within an oppressive regime, that totalitarian state. Experience could be the desire for autonomy or individuality, in a controlled environment. Rebellion in the face of terror and in the face of absolute power. The quest for freedom in a world of manipulation and restriction. The experience might be a natural affinity for love and genuine relationships in a society that shuns intimacy and pleasure. It could be the desire for happiness in a world built on fear. There are many experiences that we could look at, and it's a matter of just fine-tuning and finding ideas that you want to explore. And it might be to do with freedom or rebellion or love, those type of things, finding connection. When we think about characterisation, there is an interesting character who is not really a character in the novel, and that's Big Brother. And really this climate and this limitation to achieving one's personal desires is inhibited by the ideology and the presence of Big Brother. So Big Brother is invisible but everywhere, and there is the maxim, Big Brother is watching you. He's a very enigmatic character that's representative of the surveillance state, which is built on terror. And we could say, I've got two terms on the board there, that Big Brother is omnipresent. He's everywhere. He's a godlike figure. He's all-seeing and all-knowing. He's ubiquitous. He's everywhere. That type of thing. He is aware. He's made aware to the public through the large propaganda posters that depict him, and there is a focus on his large moustache. But he, and there are these notions of eyes, and when you look at the cover, quite a lot of the covers have that big eye, to represent that surveillance state. Winston said 40 years, it was the narrator said 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark moustache. And obviously it's a sinister smile, isn't it? It's an interesting quote from the near the end of the novel when Winston has finally been broken. And they say that Big Brother is referred to as Winston's looking at the posters, and he says the colossus that bestrode the world. That's a literary allusion to the story of Julius Caesar, and I know it's certainly in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. And it really, the colossus, this giant that bestrode the world. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was full of hubris, full of his own self-opinion and vanity, and we could look and say, well, that whilst Julius Caesar was the conqueror of the world and all-powerful, he did fall. So that is some sort of foreshadowing that's used in the novel. That's a technique that I didn't talk about in the previous tutorial. Foreshadowing is a really interesting and well-utilised device in the novel. Winston also says or thinks they could get inside you, and so he's using very visceral imagery to show the penetrating powers of Big Brother and what the regime stands for. So essentially what we have here is the experience, because of this regime, is a climate of fear. And it's this fear, this reign of terror, this notion that controls people's actions. It makes them conform. It stops them from doing things. And Winston says early in the novel, we are a living corpse. And that leads us to looking at the individual's perhaps inherent desire to rebel, that there is something within us that in situations like this that we are compelled to rebel. And that's something that we'll have a look at when we explore the character of Winston. Let's quickly talk about the characterisation of Winston Smith. We know that there's a contradiction here, that Winston, or what Orwell has done is he's referred to Winston Churchill, a powerful leader in the war effort, the Prime Minister of England, and Smith being a very common surname in Britain at the time. So you've got this contradictory sort of notion of all power and no power, and Winston sort of is a representation of that. We know that he works in the Ministry of Truth, which is quite ironic. He's seeking the truth, and he's the one that part of his job is to cover up the truth, but he's questing for the truth at the same time. He is aware of the 2-minute hate sessions, and he understands the uncontrollable exclamations of rage. He understands the purpose behind them, I think, and he doesn't want to participate in them. These are the early signs that he's not happy with his world and the life that he's living. We know that he wears blue overalls, which is a symbol and a sign for conformity, but he does not fit that mould. He unconsciously writes down with Big Brother numerous times in his diary, and despite knowing that he will be caught at some time, might not be today, it might be in years to come, he has this inherent desire to rebel. Part of the problem is that he's been raised to be denied emotional affection and intimacy, and there is something within him that desires, he has a longing for that. And when Julia writes that note, I love you, this fuels his desire to rebel. So much so that love-making and romance is seen as a metaphor, a sign of rebellion. And Winston says of his first love experience with Julia that it was a blow struck against the party. So he describes it as a battle, as a war against the ideology that he lives within, which is interesting. Julia is only a rebel from the waist down, is something that he says, and he's conflicted by the passive rebellion of Julia, and she simply wants to evade, whereas he wants to attack the central core of the party. Later on, O'Brien calls Winston the last man. That's a reference, we talked about the possibility of that being the title, but it's basically to say that, Winston is the last, it's the last man standing. It's the defeat of humanity by ideology. It's the total destruction of that human capacity by ideology. And Orwell is presenting this warning that we shouldn't surrender to the powerful narratives of politics and powerful narratives of the powerful in our world, and that essentially we must fight for our freedom and for our autonomy, and certainly the bleak ending shocks us into thinking about that. Now let's talk about the betrayal. The love. The novel's written in 3 parts, and by the time we get through part 2, we can see that there is some ill coming around the corner. And at the end of part 2, there is a bit of foreshadowing. that there are rats in the little shabby room, or there's a rat, I think it is, and so that's the fear, the thing that really terrifies Winston, and we'll see that is the device of terror used against him in room 101, where he eventually betrays Julia. I think it's interesting that there's an appropriation of the song Under the Chestnut Tree, which was a 1939 song. The artist escapes me. Glenn Miller. And Under the Shedding Chestnut Tree, I love you and you love me. And it was appropriated to I sold you and you sold me. So basically the sentiment is that they've betrayed each other, that they've given into the terror, and they weren't able to do anything but. So yeah, an interesting device used by Orwell. And then the last two sentences of the novel: he had won the victory over himself. What a paradoxical sort of idea, but it really emphasises his defeat. He has been destroyed. His soul was as white as snow. He's bereft. They've stripped. The party has stripped all life from him. And then that final line, it's really short and emphatic. He loved Big Brother, and it leaves the reader with this very bleak ending, and you're very deflated by the ending of the story, and what that does, it shocks the reader into questioning all those assumptions in our world, and it wants you to, challenges you to consider what role humanity plays in politics, in ideology, and in the grander government of the world.